The moment Clint Eastwood stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, the atmosphere instantly changed. It wasn't excitement or admiration, it was tension. Clint wasn't there to entertain or charm anyone. He came to speak about justice, integrity, and truths that Hollywood doesn't like hearing anymore. But what happened next surprised everyone. Jimmy, acting like a host but sounding like a heckler, smiled and asked, "Do you ever worry you'll turn to dust mid-scene?" The crowd laughed, but Clint didn't. He just stared, completely still, no smile, no response, just that intense look he's known for. Jimmy kept going, making fun of Clint's age, mocking his values, and saying his movies were for angry old men who still use fax machines. That's when the room started to shift, the laughter faded, and the smiles became uneasy. Clint hadn't said a single word, but now the whole audience was holding their breath. Then Jimmy pushed it further and asked, "Do you ever think your movies only matter because your fans are nostalgic for a time when men didn't cry?" That was the breaking point. Clint leaned in, looked Jimmy straight in the eyes, and said, "Shut the studio down." Not in a literal way, but even worse, Clint questioned whether Jimmy had ever created anything that truly mattered, not something viral or trendy, but something with real meaning, and the moment he said it, the crowd went completely silent while the cameras kept rolling, and for the first time in years, Jimmy Kimmel actually looked scared. And that was just the beginning, because the next thing Clint said wasn't just a personal jab, it went straight at the heart of everything Jimmy's career was built on. You could see it in Jimmy's face. He still thought this was all a joke, leaning back with a smirk, thinking the silence was just a setup for another laugh. He laughed louder, not because it was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do, then waved toward Clint and said, "Come on, Clint, it's not that serious. You know how these shows work. People want laughs, not lectures." The audience chuckled, but this time it felt uncertain, like something was off, and then Clint finally spoke, slow, calm, and sharp as a knife, saying, "You think entertainment is an excuse to mock what you don't understand, and you think if you laugh loud enough, the truth gets smaller." That hit hard, and you could see it in Jimmy's face. Something finally landed. Clint didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't have to shout. His words were low and steady, but they carried more weight than any loud joke Jimmy had ever delivered, and the audience completely stopped laughing. Clint went on, "When you've seen war up close, when you've buried friends, when you've stood up to studios, to censors, to critics, you don't mistake cheap shots for courage." Jimmy swallowed hard and tried to laugh it off, hoping to steer the moment into safer territory by asking, "So what, you think you're some kind of moral authority now?" But Clint didn't blink. He just said, "No, but I've earned the right to speak without being reduced to a punchline." That clearly hit a nerve, and Jimmy, pride wounded, dropped his smirk, leaned forward, his voice rising, the smile gone as he snapped, "You made your name playing silent tough guys who solve everything with violence. Maybe people don't want your kind of message anymore, Clint. Maybe the world's moved on." The entire studio seemed to exhale at once because that was it. That was the line you don't come back from. Clint didn't react right away. He just leaned back, arms folded, letting Jimmy's words hang in the air, letting them sink in. Then he calmly said something no one expected. "Maybe the world has moved on, Jimmy, but moving on without a spine isn't progress, it's cowardice." The room went ice cold. You could see producers panicking off camera, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some clapping, others silent, unsure what side to take. Jimmy was actually sweating now, not just nervous, but flushed and short of breath, ego bruised in front of millions. He tried again, saying, "This isn't a courtroom, Clint, it's a comedy show." But Clint didn't break eye contact, didn't laugh, didn't even blink. He just said, "That's the problem." Another silence followed, longer and heavier than before, and in that moment, the audience wasn't watching a light late-night skit, they were witnessing a reckoning. Jimmy made one last attempt to bring back the laughs with a joke about Clint's next movie being another dusty film where someone just grunts for 2 hours, but this time, no one laughed. Because Clint had done something almost no one in Hollywood ever dares to do. He told the truth, without flinching. He didn't perform, he didn't pander, Clint just spoke. And in that moment, Jimmy realized something that shook him. For the first time in his career, the audience wasn't with him, they were focused on Clint. And Clint hadn't even stood up yet. This wasn't funny anymore, and everyone knew it, Jimmy included, but he wasn't ready to back down. He had lost control of the room. The usual rhythm of setup, joke, applause had completely broken, and Clint Eastwood, sitting still like a statue carved from stone, had become the unshakable center of gravity. Still clinging to something, maybe his pride, maybe just the presence of the camera, Jimmy leaned in again, voice sharper now, his tone stripped of any humor, and said, "You act like your movies are sacred, Clint, like they're beyond criticism, but let's be honest, most of them are just old white guy fantasies and cowboy hats." The audience gasped, quiet but unmistakable, and someone in the back even whispered, "Whoa." But Jimmy didn't stop. He pushed harder, adding, "You keep playing the same role, the grizzled loner who solves everything with violence and some half-baked speech about honor. You ever think maybe the world's tired of that? Maybe it's not brave anymore, maybe it's just out of touch." And that was the moment, the line that turned tension into full confrontation. And Clint? He didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't deflect. He just sat there in complete silence. It was the kind of silence that makes people sweat, the kind that forces you to look at yourself in it, and Jimmy shifted in his seat, suddenly unsure if he was still in control or already in too deep, until Clint finally leaned forward, not quickly or dramatically, but slowly, deliberately, and said, "You call it a fantasy, I call it a memory. You mock men who stood alone because you've never had to." The crowd murmured, a few scattered claps broke the tension, but Clint wasn't done. You sit behind a desk and crack jokes for applause, but there was a time when standing for something didn't need a laugh track, it just needed guts. Jimmy visibly flinched, his smile flickering like a mask starting to slip, and he tried to pull the energy back with a joke, saying, "So now you're the morality police, huh? Gonna tell me what kind of comedy's allowed?" Clint looked straight at him and replied, "No, I'm just saying when you start laughing at everything, eventually nothing means anything." Another heavy silence followed, and then Jimmy snapped, no smirk, no clever twist, just pure venom as he said, "You know what, Clint? You're not a hero. You just played one long enough for people to forget the difference. You spent decades pretending to be men with honor, so much so that maybe you started believing it yourself." The audience froze. It wasn't playful anymore, it was a knife, and Jimmy twisted it deeper, adding, "You think you're better than everyone else just because you're old and people still pretend your movies matter. But maybe the truth is, your time is up. Maybe. The only reason you're even here is because the Academy is too scared to tell you to sit down and finally shut up." That was the line Jimmy threw, and this time the gasps were real. Some people turned their heads. Others stared at the floor, and the air turned heavy, thick with discomfort. Clint didn't move, didn't blink, and then he stood up, not to fight or yell, but to anchor the moment. The audience held its breath as he looked at Jimmy, then past him, straight into the cameras, and said, "You don't have to like my work, hell, you can hate it, but I made something, I built something, and I'll leave behind something." Then he turned his eyes back to Jimmy and added, "What are you leaving behind, Jimmy? Viral clips? Punchlines? Or a career built on mocking men who actually stood for something?" The room went dead silent. Jimmy's face lost all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The audience was split. Some clapped slowly, others just sat in stunned silence, like they had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. And then Clint delivered the line that would replay in every viral video, every social media reel, every commentary thread. "If your legacy needs everyone laughing, you're not leaving a legacy, you're leaving noise." He sat back down, calm and unbothered, while Jimmy. He suddenly looked small on his own stage. This wasn't a talk show anymore, it was a reckoning, and Clint Eastwood had just delivered a blow that silenced the entire room, not with rage or ego, but with truth. And that silence terrified Jimmy, not because he had lost an argument, but because for the first time in years, the spotlight wasn't on him, and his audience, the one trained to laugh, clap, and follow his lead, was now watching someone else. Jimmy wasn't about to let that happen, so he did what desperate men do. He made it personal, too personal, leaning forward, face tense, and said it live, unedited, no turning back. "You talk a lot about legacy, Clint. But where was that legacy when your own kids were calling you emotionally distant? When your ex-wives were talking about how hard it was to live with a man who thought life was a war movie? The audience gasped, a few laughed nervously, but most just stared, stunned. Jimmy wasn't holding back anymore, he was swinging wildly, hoping something would finally land. Maybe the reason you keep making movies about broken men is because you are one, and deep down, maybe you're scared the world's going to remember that. That was it. The moment everything shifted, not because Clint exploded, he didn't yell, didn't defend himself, but because he just looked at Jimmy with the expression of a disappointed father watching his child unravel, a look that said more than words ever could. And then Clint stood again, but this time, it was different. It felt final. The soft scrape of Clint's chair against the floor might as well have been a gunshot, and as he walked to the edge of the stage, not to leave but to speak straight to the audience, straight into the camera, his voice was calm and steady, but every word cut deeper than anything before. It's easy to mock a man when you've never stood in his shoes, easy to joke about broken families when you've never had to hold one together, and easy to point fingers when you've never carried anything heavier than a punchline. The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing, and Clint continued, "I've made mistakes, plenty, but I never ran from them, never hid behind applause, and I damn sure never tore someone down just to get a laugh." Jimmy sat in silence, for the first time all night completely speechless, with nothing left to say, and then Clint turned to him and said, "You want to win, Jimmy? You want to prove you're the sharpest guy in the room? Fine, you win. You've got the crowd, the lights, the mic, it's all yours." He paused, took a breath, and then delivered the line that would echo far beyond that stage. "But when those lights go off and this night is just another rerun in a digital graveyard, ask yourself one question. Did you say anything that mattered?" The entire room held its breath, and then it happened. Applause, real and raw, not polite, not staged, but earned, and people stood up, not everyone, but enough to shake the moment. Jimmy looked lost, reached for a joke, but nothing came. He glanced at his producers, but even they were frozen, unsure how to salvage what had just happened. Clint turned to leave, but paused, looked over his shoulder one last time, and said, "The difference between legacy and attention, Jimmy, is that one gets applause, the other gets remembered." What started as just another interview had turned into a takedown, but it wasn't just about egos, it was a message to everyone watching, to a culture drowning in noise, and Clint Eastwood had just transformed a late-night segment into something unforgettable. He stood, he spoke, and he walked away with the room behind him, while Jimmy Kimmel, still seated and still reeling, sat there no longer as a host, but as a man humiliated, a man watching the very crowd that used to laugh at his every word now stand for someone else. Now the crowd was applauding someone who had said almost nothing, and for Jimmy, that was unbearable. So as Clint turned to leave the stage, dignified and composed, Jimmy did something no one expected. He snapped. He stood up, raised his voice, and went for the lowest blow of the night, yelling, "Yeah, walk away, Clint, that's what you do, isn't it? You walk away from your messes, your marriages, your kids, your critics." The crowd gasped and froze, even Clint stopped mid-step. Jimmy, breathing hard, kept going, eyes wide, adrenaline rushing. "You built this legend around being the strong, silent type, but it's a lie. You were silent when it mattered. Silent with your family. Silent when people needed you." There was no laughter now, not even awkward shuffling, just stunned silence. He had gone too far, way too far, and you could see it on the audience's faces, not amusement or agreement, but shock, even disgust, and sympathy, not for Jimmy, but for the man he was trying to tear down. But Clint didn't lash out, didn't raise his voice. He turned, faced Jimmy head-on, and for the first time that night, something deeper stirred in him. His voice was low and cold as he said, "You want to talk about family, Jimmy? Fine, let's talk." The studio went dead silent. "I've failed people. I've let people down. I've lived long enough to bury regrets and carry them." He stepped closer, not threatening, but with a presence that couldn't be ignored. "But I've also lived long enough to learn from them." "Have you?" Jimmy stood frozen, the audience hanging on every syllable, and then Clint's voice dropped even lower, steady and sharp. "You think, pain doesn't make someone weak, but hiding from it can make someone feel empty." Clint paused, looked at the crowd, then turned to Jimmy and said, "You laugh at other people's pain because you're scared someone might see your own. The room went completely quiet. Jimmy didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. This wasn't a joke anymore, it was real. Clint took one more step and said, "You've made a career out of acting untouchable, but tonight, you showed weakness." Then he walked away. This time, Jimmy stayed silent, no jokes, no comebacks, nothing. As Clint walked off the stage, calm and strong, people started clapping again. But this time, they weren't clapping for a show. They were clapping for truth. By the next day, the moment was everywhere, on Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, and even the news. Headlines said, "Clint Eastwood silences Jimmy Kimmel without saying much." Clint didn't give interviews or post anything. He stayed quiet, and that silence said more than 1,000 words. But Jimmy couldn't hide. Even his fans started asking, why did he go so far? Why attack Clint's family? Is this what late-night shows are now? People watched old clips of Jimmy yelling and compared them to Clint's calm replies. One man looked like he was acting. The other looked honest. When Jimmy came back on his show, the mood had changed. There were no loud cheers, just light claps. He made a joke about fighting Clint in a boxing ring, but it didn't land. Then he tried to explain himself, saying it was just TV and Clint took it too seriously. But people didn't believe him. They knew what they had seen, a man who lost control and another who stayed calm. That was the moment things started to change. Jimmy's charm was fading. People weren't laughing with him, they were watching him carefully, even judging him. Over the next few weeks, guests stopped accepting his invites, his videos got fewer views, and slowly, people stopped paying attention. Not because they canceled him, but because they just didn't care anymore. When someone shows their weakness on live TV and tries to attack someone who stays strong, people don't forget that. And Clint? He never talked about it again. No tweets, no interviews, no celebration. Because real strength doesn't need to shout or brag, it just stands. In the end, it wasn't about who yelled louder or who had more fans. It was about who left with dignity. Clint didn't have to win the moment. He already had the respect. And Jimmy? He learned too late that not every joke works, not every crowd stays loyal, and some people you just don't mess with. Because some names aren't just famous, they're part of history. Clint didn't just walk away, he became the reminder that when the world forgets what respect looks like, a real man doesn't need to speak loudly. He just needs to show up. If this story gave you chills, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories where legacy speaks louder than noise.